My name is Father Cajetan Cuddy, and I'm a professor of dogmatic and moral theology at the Dominican House of Studies in Washington, D.C., and I'm also the general editor of the Encyclopedia of Catholic Theology, and I'm here to talk about what is Catholic theology. And the nature of Catholic theology comes forth from a very important fundamental truth, a truth about the reality, the created reality that God has made. And that created reality is that God has made us to know himself. So the first and fundamental starting point of Catholic theology is that he has made human nature with an intellect, with a rational soul that can be ordered to, move to, and truly be conformed to God. So Catholic theology rejects anything certainly atheistic, but also agnostic. We reject both the fact and any claim that God doesn't exist, because he does, and there are many, even philosophical demonstrations for God's existence. But also, knowing that God exists, we also believe that he's truly knowable. He's not a far-off, distant, and elusive figure. Indeed, it's possible for real, normal human persons like you and I to know with certitude, with conviction, and with life-changing implication who the God is. So the first point, by way of introduction to Catholic theology, is this: God is knowable. It is possible to know the one true God. If we were to provide a definition of Catholic theology, we could look at the very word of theology itself. Theos means, of course, God. Logos means word, discourse, even logic. And so theology means literally the study of God, the study of the knowability of God. And theology is a discourse about God. And this is very important because it shows us the orientation, the movement, the direction, the shape of what theology and Catholic theology is all about. And that is to say, it's about God. It's not about sacred sources primarily. It's not about theologians. Theologians are those who study theology. It's not even about saints. It's not even about great thinkers, sacred texts. All of those things have a place in the exercise of Catholic theology, but the heart, the core, the essence of Catholic theology is God. He is the objective. We study him. We don't study primarily or terminally, finally. Those who study God, those others who study God, we study God ourselves. That's what Catholic theology is. It's the study of God himself. It's the order of knowing the truth about God himself. And so when we talk about knowing God, which is the end, the goal, the purpose of Catholic theology, we have to consider on the side of the human person, what does it mean to know? How do we know? And this is where, first of all, we must distinguish two different kinds of theology. We can speak about natural theology on the one hand, and what I like to call supernatural, or more properly, I like to call sacred theology on the other. And the distinction between these two types of theologies is not predicated off of a distinction of subject. God is still the ultimate thing, the res, the reality that we study. Both natural theology and sacred theology study God. The difference between them, however, is that natural theology studies God under the light of, by way of the power of human reason alone. Which means natural theology, the theology of science and of philosophy, starts not with God himself, he's the end, the destination, but with the effects, the things that God has made. So in light of the things that human sensation, human experience, and human reason can discover, the human mind is able to know God indirectly in a refracted way through the things God has made, able to come to some knowledge of God himself. So natural theology is the study of God indirectly through the things that God has created by the light of, by the starting point of human reason and natural understanding. But what is sacred theology? Because that's what Catholic theology is. It's not philosophy merely. It is a divine science. Catholic theology is a divine science. So what is sacred theology? Unlike natural theology, which begins with created effects and inquires into, reasons back, comprehends through God through these effects, sacred theology starts with God. Natural theology ends with God. Sacred theology starts with God. Why? It's because God himself reveals sacred, profound, supernatural truths that reason couldn't discover by itself. God reveals to us sacred truths. And from these revealed sacred truths, these sacred truths revealed by God, we penetrate and begin to understand and search for the nature of God in light of what God has revealed to us. So if we're talking about sacred theology, because that's the type of theology that Catholic theology is, it's sacred because it starts from divinely revealed truths, principles that are given to us by God himself. Sacred theology starts with God. And with the sacred truths that God reveals to us that we couldn't discover unless God revealed them to us. What are these sacred truths? These sacred truths are, in essence, the articles of the faith. For example, the things that we profess at Mass on Sunday in the Creed. I believe in one God, the Father, the Almighty, creator of heaven and earth, of all things visible and invisible, etc. All of these things God has revealed to us. And what sacred theology does is take these divinely revealed truths, which come directly from God, and holds them up before the human mind and says, what do these mean? What does it mean that God is one in being, and yet three in divine persons, the Trinity? How can this be? What does it mean that Jesus is the eternal Son of the Father, and yet he is truly man? He truly had a human nature. He truly shared in our humanity, that he was like us in all things but sin. What does this mean? And so sacred theology then begins with divinely revealed principles, divinely revealed truths, the articles of faith that God in his wisdom and in his love has shared with us that we couldn't have access to naturally. He's given them to us out of his largesse, his mercy, and his wisdom. That's the starting point of sacred theology. But the work of sacred theology is when we start with faith, receiving these principles, but then begin to understand what these principles, what these sacred truths mean. So if we had to offer a simple, concise definition of what sacred theology is, we would say it is faith-seeking understanding. It's receiving in faith those supernatural principles God has divinely revealed that we couldn't discover by our natural resources. We receive these precious supernatural principles, articles of faith, in faith. But the journey of sacred theology is not over. In fact, it's just beginning. Once we have these sacred, supernatural, divinely revealed truths, the human mind then begins to penetrate, to inquire, and to lovingly scrutinize, what does this mean? And the beautiful thing is that this journey of understanding the faith is not just possible, but it's necessary for human salvation. It's both possible and necessary. Why is it possible? The articles of faith, the sacred truths that God reveals to us, are not just knowable, but they are first known. How are they first known? It's because God knows the truths that he shares with us about himself and what he does in the reality that he has created. And because God knows what he does, who he is, and what he's about, when he shares these sacred truths about God himself, who and what he is and what he's about, we can think God's thoughts after him. Of course, no theologian in this life thinks that our understanding can ever arrive at the degree of comprehensiveness, the exhaustiveness, the totality of God's own divine knowledge. That's impossible for a created mind like mine or like yours. However, very important, because God first knows who he is and what he's about. What he shares in revelation about who he is and what he is about is knowable, because God first knows. And through the work of sacred theology, faith, seeking, understanding, we can think God's thoughts after him. So sacred theology is the work of faith seeking understanding. Faith seeking understanding. Faith in God, receiving the sacred first principles that of Catholic theology, the articles of faith that he has given to us that are beyond our native reach. And yet the journey, as we have said, doesn't end there. We can penetrate with our minds, with our souls, with our hearts, the meaning of God's sacred mysteries, his supernatural truths. And now we focus in what exactly is the shape and the identity of this journey of understanding. And this is where in the history of the church and her theologians have explained often and in great detail and with great fervor the importance of theology as a science and a wisdom. Sacred theology is faith seeking understanding, and this journey of faith seeking understanding is both scientific and wise. What do we mean first by science when we say Catholic theology is scientific? We mean theology is scientific in the classical sense of science that traces back to the Latin word scientia, certain knowledge through causes. And so when we say that Catholic theology, faith-seeking understanding, is a scientific discipline, what we mean is that once we have these absolutely certain first truths revealed by God to us, they have intelligible, understandable content. And the human mind is able to reason, to advance, to penetrate within, to progress through, to connect, and arrive at virtual truths that are contained within these articles of faith, these first principles that maybe we didn't realize initially. So when we say that Catholic theology is a science, we speak of the fact that Catholic theology begins with articles of faith as principles, truth, statements of a sacred nature, and that the human mind that God has created is able to understand, in light of the sacred principles, the articles of faith, conclusions, implications that follow therefrom. And just as the principles of Catholic theology are certain because they come from God, and God can neither deceive nor be deceived, so also if out of one principle, one article, and another principle, all necessary implications contained within the articles of faith, the conclusions, these two share in the same certitude as the principles, even if they are below the dignity of the sacred principles because the conclusions aren't divinely revealed themselves. So to summarize, how is Catholic theology a science? It's a science because it is a discipline through which the human mind can advance in knowledge, cognition from the articles of faith that God has revealed to conclusions contained within and implied by, necessitated by the principles that God has revealed. So that's the first thing. Catholic theology is a science. The second thing is Catholic theology is a wisdom. If the movement of science, as we have seen, is to start with principles and move towards necessary and certain conclusions in light of the principles, so wisdom is focused upon the highest principles. Wisdom is different from science in that its primary goal is not to arrive at conclusions, although it can, but rather the scientific work of Catholic theology is to look at the big picture, all of the other truths of the world, of reality, of knowledge, of science, of philosophy, and even of theology itself, to organize truths in a vertically, hierarchically arranged order. So the wise man or woman, thus, the wise theologian, theology as a wisdom, is able to determine what are the most sublime and exalted and supreme of first principles divinely revealed by God, and then evaluate other principles that are still important, but are less in dignity to the most sublime principles, and to judge, wisdom judges other principles and conclusions in light of the highest first principles. So to summarize, the journey of faith seeking understanding is to know the truth about the things that God has revealed to us for us men and for our salvation, as we say in the Creed. And theology is therefore a science because it starts with those truths, those articles of faith God has revealed, and penetrates, understands, discurses, moves through those principles to arrive at their profound depth and their necessary implication conclusions. Wisdom arranges the whole thing vertically, and by arrangement we mean wisdom recognizes that not all truths, even divinely revealed truths, are equal. Some truths, for example, the truths about God himself and his inner life and being, are the most high, the most exalted, and in light of those highest truths, wisdom evaluates other truths, other principles, and the conclusions of the other principles. So Catholic theology, sacred theology, is faith seeking understanding, and therefore it's both a science and a wisdom. It's science because the truths that God has revealed to us for us men and for our salvation, as we say in the Creed, are the articles of the faith. And those articles are intelligible. They are knowable. And in fact, they're so knowable, they're so intelligible, we can understand in them other implications and conclusions that necessarily follow from them. Science proceeds horizontally, we might say. Wisdom, on the other hand, proceeds vertically, because wisdom doesn't just reason from principles to conclusions, but regards the highest principles, the highest truths, as the ultimate, architectonically, knowability-wise important starting points for all of our reflection about other principles and about other conclusions. Science is a wisdom because all of reality is three-dimensional, horizontal, and vertical because of God's infinitude, goodness, and wisdom. So Catholic theology is one insofar as it's united in the articles of faith. The articles of faith are the universal, first and only starting points for the work of theology. All of theology in any subdiscipline is the science of faith seeking understanding and the wisdom of faith. Nonetheless, within that unified whole of the one work of Catholic theology, faith seeking understanding, there are different subdisciplines, specifics within sacred theology. And these relate to the fact that within theology, there are different types of subjects we can focus upon, recognizing that all of these subdisciplines fall under and within the one unified sacred theology. And for example, one of the first and important subdisciplines of sacred theology is what's known as dogmatic theology. And this refers to the Catholic dogmas, the doctrines, the teaching of the Church about who God is, who Jesus is, what the sacraments are, what does it mean for God to be the creator of all that is, what does it mean for Jesus to be the redeemer of us men and for our salvation. Dogmatic theology undertakes the work of faith-seeking understanding in light of the dogmas. And then you can also have what is known as moral theology. Again, moral theology is still theology. It's faith-seeking understanding. The difference is that moral theology seeks the understanding of faith in light of God as the ultimate origin and end, not just of reality in general, but of the human person in particular. So the moral theologian examines, what does it mean for God to be our ultimate end? What does it mean to be the God, for the fact that God God is our salvation? What does it mean that all things, including human thinking, willing, loving, and feeling, are ordered to God through the decisions that punctuate the human life? What happens when the human person begins to move towards God with deliberation, with intentionality? Here we speak about the virtues, the changes that occur in the human person by means of another important topic within moral theology, the topic of grace. What is grace? How is it that God, who is infinite and immutable, can share himself with me, a finite and mutable creature? That's what grace is, God sharing himself with us being brought up, divinized to the level of God. What is the role of law? Is law just a list of rules and prescripts and proscripts or prohibitions, or is it something that bespeaks the order of reality and the order of nature? All of these things within moral theology study God, faith, seeking understanding. But God is the end of the human person. God is the savior of the human person. And what grace, what virtue, what human action, what law means for the human life. Of course, also, if we zoom back within sacred theology and look at the distinction between faith and reason, how does reason and faith, how do they interact? How are they distinct? How do they come together? Where does philosophy, the science of reason, and theology, the science and wisdom of faith, how do they come together? This is the focus of a discipline known as fundamental theology that looks at the fundamental methods, the fundamental lights of philosophy and theology. And then, of course, you can have the experts, the theologians who engage the knowledge of God to study God in light of the sacred sources. You have biblical theology, which looks at God in light of written divine revelation. You can also have theology and theologians who study God under the aspect of how have other theologians throughout history, church history, studied God, the history of dogma. What was it about St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Bonaventure, Blessed Duns Scotus, St. Augustine? How did they study God? We can also, in the quest to know God, look at theologians with profit within sacred theology insofar as we look to them not as ends in themselves, but as instruments through which we can be better aimed in our knowledge of God. So in sum, sacred theology is one. It's a unified whole. There are not many theologies because there's one deposit of faith. There's one body of divinely revealed truths. We reason from those truths to understand within those truths what the faith implies, what the faith contains. The faith is knowable. But within the unified whole of sacred theology, it is truly possible to specialize, to focus on the dogmas, to focus on the Christian life, moral theology, to focus on theological method and its relationship to other disciplines, fundamental theology, to study divine revelation in the scriptures directly in a salvation historical, textual, critical context, biblical studies, to study the history of Catholic theology, the history of dogma, the study of church history, for example. All of these things are legitimate disciplines because all of them fall within the one coherent journey of the human person to know the truth about God, faith, seeking, understanding. So Catholic theology, sacred theology, is faith, seeking, understanding. That's what theology is, and that's what theology does. But is it just an intellectual, cerebral, abstracted, impractical discipline? And the answer is no. Theology is marvelously both the most sublime, theoretical, speculative, profound study the human person can undertake, because it's studying God, who is the infinite being. But it's also the most practical, the most relevant, and the most significant of all the other disciplines the human person can study. And so what are those implications of sacred theology? Well, we see these most especially when it comes to priestly and pastoral ministry and in day-to-day Christian living. Who the human person is and who God is, and the human person's journey towards God, union with God, how we think about God and how we think about our humanity will affect how we live our Christian life. If I think God is a material being who only lives in Texas or in Korea or in Paris, France, he does not, by the way, but if I were to have an error like that in my theology, then that would affect my Christian living, because I would think, well, I have to live in Texas or in Korea or in Paris to be united to God. But when I realize that, no, God is everywhere because he's infinite, he's omnipresent, his wisdom and power and causality knows no limits, all that is held in being by God's power, then I know no matter where I am, no matter what circumstance I find myself in, God is there. And this God who is there knows me, loves me, and enables me to know and love him. How we think affects how we live. And therefore, because theology is concerned with thinking rightly about God, it will definitely and necessarily affect how we live for God. Specifically, additionally, with regard to the sacraments of the church, one of the most important things that priests undergo in their seminary formation is to understand who God is and who the human person is, so that we can understand what the church is all about. At every Mass, Jesus is imparted through the sacrament of communion. In every confession, Jesus comes down and saves us, redeems us, forgives us, applies, more properly speaking, his redemption to our lives, to our sins, to our guilt here and now. And if I don't understand who God is and who I am, and what holy union with God looks like, and what disordered distance from God looks like, I won't understand why I need a Savior, why Jesus is important, why the Mass is a regular Sunday and holy day of obligation, why I need the sacrament of penance. All of the 7 sacraments are instituted by Jesus and are revealed by Jesus in light of who God is, who we are, and how we relate to God. So in a word, it is of the utmost imperative that all sincere and devout Christians, even if we aren't capital I intellectuals, do a little theology. Because if we don't know who God is, if we don't undertake the role, the task, the burden, and indeed the privilege of faith-seeking understanding, we won't understand why God does what he does, why the church and the sacramental life of the church is so important, how to preach and explain and articulate the intelligibility of God, either from the pulpit as a priest or deacon, or in the workplace or at school, in amongst our family and colleagues as a layperson. If we don't know who God is, we will have difficulty living lives ordered to God. As a man or woman thinketh in his or her heart, so is he or she. And how as we think about God, that has a direct effect on whether we live towards God or not. So now let's speak about theologians. If theology is faith-seeking understanding, theologians are those who undertake the task of understanding what is contained in the faith, what has been revealed by God. Now, of course, there are capital T theologians, professional theologians, those people who teach in theology at university and seminary settings and write books and articles about them. Those people exist. However, in a very real sense, all of the baptized are theologians, because all the baptized have received the faith and are invited by God as rational creatures to understand this God who has recreated them in baptism and has called them, the people, his divinely adopted children, to himself. So all of us, no matter what our rank or our position is, all of us are called to be theologians, and indeed all of us are invited to be theologians, to understand what God has revealed about himself and about what he does in us because of himself. And so what are some of the features of the theologian? The first is, of course, humility. It is a remarkable thing that the infinite, the ineffable, the supreme, the wise, the omnipotent God, creator of the universe, redeemer of humanity, has deigned to share with us mere mortals, finite, little, eensy, weensy, teensy human persons with small and weak minds. He has deigned to share with us his divine truth. In addition to being a discipline of profound humility before God, it's also a discipline of profound magnanimity. And by that we mean there is a big souledness, there's a big holy ambition of the theologian to aspire to understand these precious truths that God has given us freely from his divine goodness and love for us. It would be a waste if we were to think that God just gave us these precious truths and we just keep these precious truths in our pocket, don't scrutinize them, don't appreciate them, don't penetrate in them, don't utilize the gifts that God has given us. That's a waste. So Catholic theology is both a very humble discipline because we know that we are not the origin of the first principles. They come from God. And yet it's a magnanimous discipline because it says, wow, if God has given us, unworthy though we are, these profound truths that are truly knowable, then I can. God doesn't do anything in vain. It is possible to know, to aspire to achieve some true and profound knowledge about God. So Catholic theology is both humble and it's magnanimous. Practically speaking, concretely speaking, it's also a discipline that requires great industry. Catholic theology is not simply Lectio Divina. It's not simply spiritual reading. It's not simply listening to pious, holy, and even profound spiritual authors and teachings. It is the active work of, okay, Lord, I will apply my mind, my soul, my heart to understanding what you have said. And I will do that to the utmost degree of my capacities, which means that I have to think and reflect and contemplate with intensity, with care, with precision, with research in a way that stretches the natural capacities, the natural habits, the natural practices of our own reflection. The work of a profound and faithful Catholic theologian is an arduous work because God invites the human mind to be stretched, so to speak, up to himself. And finally, there are many other things, but there's another very important thing that is characteristic of Catholic theologians, and that is gratitude. No Catholic theologian thinks that what he or she does is the end, the product, the ultimate goal of his or her thought. Rather, through faith-seeking understanding, we search for the one true God. And we realize then that from beginning to end, from the principles that we have received, from our very nature, which has an intellect that can undertake the task of understanding, all of this is a gift. And we have the example and the writings and the precedents of some of the greatest minds, the greatest souls of history, Catholic theologians, St. Augustine, St. Bonaventure, St. Thomas Aquinas, Blessed Duns Scotus, Luis de Molina, Joseph Ratzinger, and on and on and on. We can look with gratitude to the good things that God has done in their minds and in their hearts and receive from them wisdom through their instrumentality to understand God. So in sum, Catholic theology is a humble discipline. It's a magnanimous discipline. It's an arduous and demanding discipline. And it's a discipline shaped by gratitude for all that we have received from God, whether it be the principles from God, whether it be our power of knowing, our nature from God, or the elder brothers and sisters in faith and theology that God has provided for us in the saints and in the doctors and theologians of the Church. What are some of the ways that we begin Catholic theology? And even more than the ways to begin Catholic theology, what is the ultimate origin of Catholic theology and the practice of Catholic theology? We have to start first and foremost, of course, with the seven sacraments. In a very real way, Catholic theology begins with the sacrament of baptism, because through the sacrament of baptism, we are united to God. He imparts his divine life and being to us and gives us a sacramental character that configures us to him forever, so that even if we suffer, we fall, our whole life, our whole being is ultimately searching for God. Baptism points us in the direction of God, and therefore in the sacrament of baptism, the journey of Catholic theology begins. But for those that are interested in beginning and undertaking the serious task, not just of reading holy things about God, pious things about God, good as they are, and I'm all for spiritual reading, but want to really apply their mind to the intense, arduous, and demanding task of Catholic theology, there are several things that are very useful. First and foremost, by way of preparation, the study of words is very important. Language is very important. Why? Because words reflect thoughts, and thoughts are conformed to reality, and therefore the words that we use, like transubstantiation, like consubstantial with the Father, like person, like nature, all of these words correspond to the understanding that we have of the faith that ultimately corresponds to the God who gives faith. Words, language, precision matter. Beyond words and concepts, it's also important for the theologian in preparation to have a facility with the discipline of logic. Because logic is not only about words, but it's about propositions. Propositions are words forming sentences which makes statements. That's where the theologian's work has to operate with great frequency. The science and art of logic enables us to think carefully, to think rigorously, to think deliberately about what God has revealed. Logic is not over the faith, but rigorous logic serves the faith because it looks at what must be true about the content, the deposit of faith, the divine revelation that God has given us. With those tools in our intellectual satchel, so to speak, then it's wonderful and useful to find mentors, either living or who have written great books of Catholic theology, to show us what it is, what it looks like to apply our mind and heart rigorously to the articles of faith. And this is where I recommend that we study, first and foremost, the Catechism, but also the writings of great theologians like St. Augustine, like St. Thomas Aquinas, like St. Bonaventure, just to name a few, to see exemplified before us what does a great mind, a great soul, a humble yet magnanimous soul, what does it look like when these men and women apply their minds to God? And again, we remember, however, that theology does not terminate in the study of theologians. It's not theologianology, it's theology. And yet, theologians can help us understand theology. So, to begin the work of Catholic theology, pay attention to words, pay attention to logic, pay attention to the writings of great theologians, pay attention to the Catechism, read your Bible, which contains, in a unique way, a written way, parts of divine revelation. Through the Catechism, we have access also to sacred tradition. If those who wish to begin sacred theology, place themselves in contact with all of these, they will be on their way. And finally, and most importantly, avail yourselves of the seven sacraments. If we don't spend time with God at Mass in confession, we will not be able to understand God. The mind is only able to be conformed to the reality of God if that mind, that soul, is in regular union with that God, and this union takes place in the seven sacraments of the Catholic Church. In the end, if someone were to ask you or me, why is Catholic theology important? And we had to only give one word, that word would be happiness. Human persons are hardwired irrevocably for happiness. And that happiness is only possible and only achieved in knowing, and because we know, loving the one true God. No one can be fully happy if they don't know who God is, because God has made us for himself. And so ultimately, the single word answer for the purpose of studying Catholic theology is infinite beatific happiness. Happiness is also the topic in relation to sacred theology that receives prime place in the opening of my book, Catholic Theology, an Introduction, published by the Encyclopedia of Catholic Theology and available at ect.org. This book, Catholic Theology, an Introduction, is the first of the Catholic Handbook series that attempts, like our online content, to make available in print form pocketable, readable, handy resources for those who wish to begin the journey of sacred theology. And for other resources and material like this and like these, I encourage you to go to our website to support the ECT project and to join us in our journey of faith-seeking understanding.